Bookseller Crow on the box. Tales from an empty bookshop.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest Bookseller Crow on the box. Very excited tonight to have Hannah Ross here in conversation with James Spackman. Hannah Ross's new book is Revolutions, How Women Changed the World on Two Wheels. And I'm really excited that we have Hannah virtually with us as well, because a long time ago, she worked as my publicist for Jonathan Cape. And now, years later, we have her having written her own book. So it's all wonderful and come round in a lovely circular motion. And James Spackman is going to be speaking with Hannah tonight and hosting the conversation. And James is a cyclist, cycling publisher, a cyclist and a feminist, and an old friend of the Bookseller Crow. So we're really pleased that he's joined us tonight and is going to have a wonderful conversation with Hannah about her book. So I'll hand you over, and congratulations, Hannah. So cheers.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Karen. And God, I wish I'd prepped with a glass of wine. I feel left out. And thank you so much. Yeah, I have extremely fond memories of when I was a sales rep for Bloomsbury, coming and sitting and talking about books in your shop, which was wonderful. But yes, Revolutions, what a fantastic book. I finished it yesterday and I absolutely loved it, Hannah. And so I'm really delighted to be the one quizzing you about it. And I'm going to start with a really, really simple question, which is why write this book? What made you want to write this history of cycling now?
There's quite a few sort of reasons why, sort of how this came about. I think one of them, most obviously, is no one else has done it, which in publishing is quite unusual. As far as I know, I haven't found another book quite like this that tells kind of a story of women and bikes, sort of from the very origins of the first bicycles to now, and all types of cyclists. And actually, when I was writing it, I thought, gosh, I possibly have been quite ambitious in trying to do it all. Anyway, just about managed it, I hope. But yes, other reasons as well. Another one is that my great grandfather raced at Herne Hill Velodrome in the 1890s, which is when sort of the bicycle was at its height of its popularity. This was then called the safety bicycle, and it had been invented around a decade before that, and had really kind of taken the Western world by a storm. And bicycles on the streets of most European, American, Canadian cities are just everywhere. And my great grandfather started racing at the velodrome, and I became curious about whether there were any women who were doing that at the same time. It took me a while to find this out, but also sorry, it's quite a long response now. I start the book by talking about a incident in Cambridge in the late 1890s, where a very large group of protesting male students at Cambridge University have created an effigy of a woman on a bicycle, and they've suspended it from a building, and they will later take it apart and decapitate it. And the reason they did this was because they were protesting against the women students at university who had petitioned to get full degrees, equivalent to what their male counterparts would receive, because at that time they weren't getting them. They could study, but they couldn't get a degree. So quite rightly, they were asking to have the same treatment and have a degree. But this is a really interesting kind of image and of why it's a woman on a bicycle. And the reason is because at that time, sort of thinking women, independent women, feminist women were often seen as, were quite often interested in bicycles, and the bicycle then became, in a way, sort of synonymous with sort of women who wanted independence and freedom. And so it's sort of, it kind of, the bicycle encapsulated a lot of these sort of ideas that were kind of coming to the forefront at that time for women, that would kind of evolve into sort of mass movements for emancipation with the suffrage movements in the next century. So I became particularly interested in that, and the fact that bicycling for women was political and deeply embedded in the history of feminism. But the story of cycling is predominantly, or has been predominantly, about men. And so, but women have been cycling from the very beginning and have continued to do so. So I wanted to sort of tell those stories. I mean, some of them obviously are known, but just kind of celebrate those stories and celebrate that kind of history and connection with women and bicycles, because unfortunately, despite the women's relationship with bicycles going back to the very beginning of the bicycle, still far fewer women cycle than men, which is a real shame. So another thing that I hope to achieve with this book was to perhaps inspire some more people, some more women to get onto bicycles. So very long answer.
Yeah, no, but very but very good answer, and I'm certain that it will inspire a lot of women to ride. And I love that thought that you're essentially helping to kind of write women back into their rightful place in the history. And it's extraordinary to hear what you said about Herne Hill Velodrome, obviously very local venue for the Bookseller Crow, and yeah, absolutely that people were. Your great grandfather was cycling there, and you found out that women were cycling there right from the very start, but just there'd been that lack of recording, and their achievements hadn't been recorded. So I think it's a tremendous goal.
Yeah, and in the UK, sort of women's racing in the sort of 1890s, around that time, was taken relatively seriously, which is kind of really interesting. Although, as you say, I couldn't find a huge amount out about it unless you go back to reading kind of the race reports from the multiple cycling magazines that were around at that time. It was crazy. I spent a lot of time in the British Library, actually, really enjoyably reading all those publications that were full of just fascinating things. But lots of race coverages and profiles of women who raced, and it was quite a sort of lively scene. But unfortunately sort of died away at the turn of the century. In America, it's a little bit different. Again, there were women who raced on bicycles. There was a particularly famous troupe of women who did what they called 6-day races, and they toured around America. But the League of American Wheelmen, that was kind of the authority of the sort of ran professional racing, wouldn't let them race on any velodrome that men used. And they said if they held women's races in those velodromes would be closed down. So they were making tracks specifically for these women to race on. So again, women were racing, but it was just a slightly different, slightly more constrained than the UK. But still quite a lively scene, and thousands of spectators would go and see these women race, which I thought was just really extraordinary. I mean, cycle racing was kind of one of the biggest spectator sports at that time, but women's racing as well was hugely popular.
But that's such a strong theme in the book. Because that seems like a weird constraint, sort of segregating the two sexes on different tracks. But that was one thing that came through really strongly to me, was that throughout it there was, the patriarchy, oppressing women trying to cycle, but it was done in this maddeningly inconsistent way, wasn't it? Sometimes women were being told you can't cycle, it'll make you infertile. Other times it was you can't cycle, it'll make you promiscuous or whatever. And sort of what men's problem with it seemed to change every decade or even more frequently.
Absolutely, yeah, you're completely right. And the height of that kind of misinformation about what bicycling for women would do to you was around the early sort of years of cycling, so sort of late 1880s, early 1890s, where many people seem to have an opinion about what damage it could do to you, which was all really about kind of controlling women. And I talk a lot in the book about sort of the lack of freedoms generally that women had at that time. They had no autonomy generally over, certainly not financial, or and if you were a middle class woman, you wanted to go into further education, that was extremely limited. And the clothes they wore was also all about keeping you in one place. So this idea of this bicycle, which is sort of all about kind of freedom and independence and going where you want to on your own, under your own steam, would have been quite, I mean, it's a novelty for everyone at that time, but for women would have challenged so many conventions. And so it wasn't just men as well. There were lots of kind of moralists, women moralists as well, who were coming out and saying it would be women's downfall. And but yeah, predominantly it was men who were saying these things about what sitting on a saddle might do to you, and how you're squandering your chances of having children if you ever step onto a bicycle seat, because at this time that you wouldn't even have ridden a horse astride. Women were still riding side saddles, so this idea of kind of sitting across the saddle was kind of charged with various negative associations for certain people.
It's almost like these men were sort of seeing symbolism there and not being able to quite express it. So in some other way. But there was, I mean, if that was in the very early days, there's still those kind of peculiar sort of double standards still crop up a little bit later on. I mean, there's so many fascinating women in this book that I want to ask you about. But one of them is Alfonsinastrada, who maybe you can tell us a little bit about her, who was sort of pushed forwards as a novelty, but then the very next year suppressed. Can you tell us a bit about her?
Yeah, she's really extraordinary. I mean, her story's reasonably well known, but I just had to include it in this book because it was just phenomenal. But so she is Italian, and in her teens became obsessed by cycling. Her family didn't approve at all. This was around the sort of 1910s, the 1920s. But she didn't listen to them. She carried on. She took part in kind of the non-professional races in her area and would win. And I think from reading, I think the prizes were bizarre, like chickens or pigs or something. But she married someone who was also huge in cycling and supported her. I think her wedding present from him was a racing bicycle, and she got quite well known in sort of on the European racing scene. France and Italy were a bit better actually for women's racing, even in the UK. There were quite a few kind of well-known women's cyclists, and they were going for hour records, even though at this time women's racing wasn't actually official, so they weren't officially recorded, but they were still attempting them. And this is something she went for as well. But she because she was so well known, sort of in the kind of the men's racing scene, she was also known, and the organizer of the Giro d'Italia, in a year, it was when a number of their star riders weren't able to take part or weren't taking part. The organizer asked her to ride, and it was a publicity stunt, really. But she was probably very much aware of this, but wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to be the only woman at that time who's ever cycled one of the biggest men's races, what is and still is one of the biggest men's races in the world, the Giro d'Italia. And she had this extraordinary ride. I mean, she was ultimately she was taken out of the race, or suspended because she didn't manage to finish one of the days in the time allowed. But the organizer realized how popular she was and how all these Italians were waiting out on the road to see her go past, and it had created so much publicity for the race that he kept her in the race and she carried on till the end. But just amazing kind of tenacity and really kind of extraordinary story, and kind of her battle to finish this race is it's really kind of a real story of
and just
adversity.
And just to butt in a little bit for those, I mean, I'm sure some of the audience will be keen cycling aficionados, maybe some others not, but the Giro d'Italia, like the Tour de France in that era, it was on unfinished roads, on single speed bicycles, wasn't it? I mean, for anyone to finish is impressive. So
yeah,
she did an extraordinary thing.
Yes, and you're on your own as well. There's no team backing you up and mending your punctures and fixing your bicycles. I think one accident she had to improvise and use a broom handle instead of her handlebars because they'd become so mangled. I think that was the day that she didn't make it back to the finish in time. But yeah, just this image of this woman with all these male riders battling up these Italian mountains and finally ending up in Rome to this amazing kind of hero's welcome is extraordinary. But the really sad thing is she thought that she would then be a fixture in this race. She would be invited into other races. I've been allowed into this inner sanctum. And I've brought huge amounts of attention to the race. But the following year she was told she couldn't take part. But she still continued to race, and I think she did achieve quite a remarkable hour record, and she continued for quite some time. But yeah, her story is really, really special, and I think she is probably the only woman. She's still the only woman to have done the Giro d'Italia. There is a rumor that there's a woman, a French woman, who rode the Tour de France, but it's a bit dubious about whether it is actually confirmed. So I think probably we could say that Alfonsinastrada is the only woman to do one of the big three of the European stage races.
Yeah, God, that's extraordinary. Somebody else, I mean, I'm dotting around a little bit kind of chronologically, but somebody else I can't resist asking you about is a real hero of mine, and somebody you've met, and it's appropriate to talk about her in context of this audience, because she's an author as well as a cyclist. So Devlo Murphy, who I remember publishing when I turned up at John Murray as a kind of as a salesperson some years ago, and she, I can't remember how many books she'd written, but she was in her 80s by then, and she's just an absolute legend of travel writing and of cycling. But you actually went to meet Devlo and found out her extraordinary sort of origin story.
Yeah, that was a really, really special day, and I feel so honoured that she took the time to see me. It was I wasn't sure whether she would even be there when I got there, because communication was a bit hit and miss. She was in her 90s then, and well, still is. And I decided that I mean, it's not a huge distance, but I decided that if I was going to see Devlo Murphy, I would cycle there. So took the ferry to Ireland and then cycled from the ferry to her village, her town, Lismore, which is very beautiful in County Waterford. And she lives in this old market, what was the old pig market, I think, in the centre of the town, which was full of these little buildings. And she cooked me lunch, and we talked for a really long time about her travels, the journey, which she's most famous for, which was when she cycled from Ireland to Delhi, to India, which she wrote a very famous book about. And that was the first big sort of substantial trip that she took, and she would then go on to do many more. Some of them on bicycles, some of them on foot, walking, cycling thousands of miles and walking thousands of miles as well, and in really kind of sort of unknown places. And her whole story is just fascinating. She had to leave school in her early teens to look after her very ill mother, and she cared for her almost solo on her own until she was in her early 30s. When she was 10 years old, Devlo, and had been given a bicycle, she said, "I'm going to cycle to India." So she'd been waiting that long. She'd been waiting over 20 years to make this journey. And so when her mother finally passed away, she set out about 6 months later, in the coldest winter in Europe, I think, that they'd ever seen. But she was absolutely determined. She wasn't going to delay this journey anymore, and had quite a few mishaps on the way because of the unbelievable ice and snow. But this was the 1960s. She was a woman on her own, cycling through Turkey, Afghanistan, Iran. In Afghanistan, they tried to stop her entering the country on her own because they had a sort of unofficial ban on solo women travellers, because a woman had been murdered there quite recently. And Devlo said, "Look, I could get murdered in Europe. Women get murdered in Europe all the time. I'm coming in." And people just couldn't believe that there was this woman cycling through their country, and they tried to offer her lifts. They thought, well, it's because you can't afford to take transport. If you can't afford to drive, you can't afford to take the buses. We'll give you a lift. Not really understanding that for Devlo, it was all about this journey.
It does sound, doesn't it, as though, I mean, from talking to other cycling, was it female adventure cyclists like Emily Chappell and others, that it's such a common theme that men imposing their perception of risk on you and saying, "Oh, no, you can't go there. You've got to get into my car," or whatever.
Yeah.
But she resisted.
Yeah, and actually Afghanistan was the country that she fell in love with more than any other country, and just found everyone that she met there unbelievably welcoming. And not that there weren't instances along the way in other countries as well, which are fairly hair-raising actually. But it's an extraordinary trip to do this at that time. I mean, she went through places where they had never seen a woman on a bicycle. Some of them had never seen a bicycle. And she writes about how, what I think is quite interesting, she writes about how she dressed in quite a sort of androgynous way. Her hair was short, and she sort of felt that she was just seen as a human being. She wasn't seen as a woman on a bicycle. She was just a person, and she really loved that. She was kind of stripped of those prejudices or associations. It's just she was free to just kind of immerse herself in the environment and the landscape and meeting people. It was a tremendous book. Yeah, it is a tremendous book.
And for anyone watching this who hasn't read it, I mean, Full Tilt, that is the right title, isn't it, for the first one, Full Tilt?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of starts with her setting off with all sorts of packing, doesn't it? And including a revolver, which you probably won't need that. And we won't tell you whether she did or not, but it is a remarkable read, and probably available in all good Crystal Palace bookshops, no doubt. And I mean, I hesitate to make you do a kind of a greatest hits of all the heroes in the book, but there's a couple of others that we've got to talk about. Annie Londonderry, we've got to talk about her, and her story was one I thought I knew, because she'd done this massive round the world cycling trip. But I think that the way you told the story brought out some really interesting aspects to that. So maybe you could briefly tell us who she was.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's so. I'd need hours really, but Annie, she was called Annie Kopchovsky, and she was a Lithuanian immigrant living in Boston. And the reason we know all this is because her great nephew did some amazing research. He had no idea he had this extraordinary ancestor, and he managed to trace down all the documents and piece it together. And this is why we kind of know about Annie now. But she was living in Boston. I think she sold advertising space for a magazine and had various children, several children. And the story goes that she, this is all a little bit unclear, but two men apparently made a bet that a woman couldn't cycle around the world. And this was at a time of the kind of sort of great Victorian sort of era of exploration, where it was sort of that Phileas Fogg. Lots of people were kind of setting out to make records and using different sort of the new kind of technology and transport. Someone called Nellie Bly, who was a newspaper journalist, very famously made a record of getting around the world using all different types of transport. But Annie set out to do this on a bicycle, and apparently she hadn't actually ridden a bicycle before she agreed to take on this challenge. And why it was Annie who was chosen for this is still a little bit unclear, but she did. And she set out from Boston in 1894 and started for New York. And part of the bet was that she also had to make money along the way, which is a little bit extraordinary. That she was the most extraordinary kind of self-publicist and hustler, and she managed to get sponsorship. So she actually said she became known as Annie Londonderry because Londonderry, it was I think a bottled water company sponsored her. So she had this plaque on her bicycle. She set out on a kind of quite heavy woman's bicycle in long skirts, what any woman at that time would have been wearing. And by the time she got to New York, she was absolutely shattered. Realised she was going the wrong way, and set off. She set off. Well, her ambition had been to get to San Francisco and go west to east. But in the end, she ended up trying to go west, realizing that she wouldn't get over the mountains in time for the snow, and ended up coming all the way back to New York again. But in this time, she got a new sponsor who'd given her a much lighter, faster men's bicycle, not a kind of step-free heavy bicycle. And she had changed her skirt for bloomers, professional dress, which definitely would have helped with the weight and her ability to kind of cover a few more miles without feeling absolutely exhausted. So anyway, she ended up going back to New York and taking a boat to France. But she did make this journey in the time that was allocated to her. But to say she cycled around the world is probably, there's a caveat that actually she did take a few boats and trains because apparently that was never stipulated. But at the same time, she did an extraordinary amount of cycling as well. The reports of her cycling through France are really, I thought, particularly lovely, because along the way she was always accompanied by groups of cyclists from local cycling clubs. And when she got to Nice, so she started in Paris, and by the time she got to Nice, she was a global superstar. I think probably at that time that everyone would have known who she was, which makes it even more extraordinary that she then kind of disappeared. Her story kind of disappeared, and people really didn't know about this until her ancestor started looking, delving into history around it, and the fact that even her family didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, there really should be a movie, shouldn't there?
Yeah, there really should. I think someone is doing it.
Really? Oh, good.
Yeah, I have a vague recollection that someone got in touch with me and told me that that's happening. But yeah, I mean, it's really extraordinary, and the ventures she got into on the way, and
Because I think when I first heard her story, it was very much in terms of, well, here's somebody that might have done the round of the world trip, but she was a little bit iffy. Whereas actually, what I love about this fuller story is that evidently she did something athletically really remarkable, but also she was the boss of her own enterprise and of her own identity as well, and she manipulated that in the way that seemed best to her. And it seems extraordinarily kind of contemporary in a way what she was doing.
I mean, I think what people sort of have found difficult, and it is difficult, is that she invented a lot of what happened to her, and she said that she had cycled through most of Asia, which she just couldn't possibly have done, but it created these incredible stories about what had happened to her, where she'd been sort of shot at and she passed through war zones and been prisoner of war in the Japanese prison camp, but at the same time you did go to many of these places, and the fact that she was just such a kind of forceful and incredible personality to just keep this whole show going and keep the interest in her story going, which is what she was told to do in order to win this bet, to get the publicity. It's just really extraordinary.
It really is amazing. We should kind of drag ourselves a little bit further sort of up to date into the modern era and talk a bit about what women's cycling is like now. I mean, there's obviously various different aspects to it. There's cycling as a mode of transport, and there's lots of different aspects to it. But from a sporting point of view, I think we're at quite an interesting point, aren't we? And you've talked to people in different genres of cycling, the kind of the sort of road cycling scene, the kind of Tour de France type stuff, the mountain biking scene, which has a different flavor to it. But I was really delighted that you'd interviewed Helen Wyman, who's a cyclist that I've really enjoyed watching compete in cyclocross, which for the benefit of anybody that's not familiar, is a particular genre of cycling where you do circuits of basically of muddy fields, and it's intended to be quite kind of rough, so you have to jump off and carry your bike for a bit, and then there's always sand and all that sort of stuff. It's really tough, and it's quite historically it's been quite a kind of a conservative and quite a closed community, so you wouldn't necessarily expect the cyclocross specialism to be progressive, but Helen, having stopped riding full time, got involved in the administration of the sport and seems to have worked absolute wonders.
So she essentially has equalized the sport, which in cycling is a really, really big thing, because James you mentioned road, the Tour de France, the road cycling that has a long way to go. But in cyclocross, Helen has made it pretty much a level playing field now. So the kind of the things where that are particularly problematic in women's cycling and in the women's sport generally is media coverage. She got all the women's races onto the TV. And I think they are as watched as men's races now, some of them probably even more so. And I know mountain biking, that's the same as well. Prize money, getting the prize money equalised with the men's, and opportunities. If there's a men's race, there's a women's race. I mean, I'm making it sound sort of very simple. I mean, it's not. It's a bit more complex than that. But and she proved there were, obviously there were always going to be doubters when she came in and said, I want, we need to have the TV coverage. If we get the TV coverage, people are going to want to see it. People are going to want to come and sponsor the races. There will be money, and people are going to want to watch it. And she proved them right on all of this. And it's such a just a gloriously wonderful and uplifting story about what can happen when someone says, no, I'm not going to stand for this anymore, let's kind of drag this into the 21st century and change this, because it's ridiculous. Why are women not giving the same opportunities as the men? I mean, it's just no, you can't defend that at all. And she has really transformed the sport. And I think Helen herself has made probably cyclocross in general more high profile. I think people are much more aware of it, partly because of what Helen's done, both the men's and the women's, because she's been such a kind of amazing personality. So yeah, it's really, really impressive.
And by making a success of it, it's also, you know, got the potential to be incredibly influential in other bits of cycling and other parts of sport, because, you know, as she has, and she says herself that, you know, people don't care if it's men or women, they just want a good battle. And once you get to learn a couple of riders, you realize there's a rivalry there, you know, you're in. And you know, it doesn't surprise me in the least that the ratings are basically 50-50, and if it can happen for women's cyclocross, it can happen for, you know, all types of women's cycling and all types of women's sport. So let's hope it does. I'm conscious that we might be running to you know, getting towards the end of our allotted time, and I'm slightly gutted because there's lots of things that I wanted to talk to you about, not least about the suffragette internet, which I can't remember whether that's a phrase from the book or just something I wrote down, but there's this wonderful description you have of suffragettes organizing by kind of, you know, going out spreading messages by bicycle all across London in particular, but I'm sure other cities as well, and just what an extraordinary kind of tool it was for them to organize and to be effective.
And how the Pankhursts were very, very enthusiastic cyclists and members of the Manchester branch of the Karen Cycling Club in the 1890s, which is really kind of quite a fun thing to think about, them kind of pedaling away around the country lanes around Manchester. I don't know that they got to do much cycling after they'd founded the WSPU, which is the suffragettes organisation. But as you say, cycling was really kind of core to the organisation. It was one of the ways that they took the message to people that would have been a bit harder to get to. This is when most people really didn't have cars. They would, you know, to have a car would have been, you know, you would have been very, very wealthy. And trains didn't take you everywhere you wanted to go. So women just got on their bikes and pedalled to towns and villages, stood up on soapboxes, distributed the Votes for Women newspaper. But they were also used when the organisation became militant. They were used as getaway vehicles after setting places on fire. And there's quite a fun story about two women who were pedalling away after setting fire to a mansion in Surrey. But the reason they got stopped was because they didn't have lights on front of their bicycles.
Nice. It's, well, I mean, it's just one story from, you know, an absolute wealth of stories in this book, Hannah, and, you know, huge congratulations on writing it. I know that the amount of research that you've done, you know, the archival stuff and the people you've spoken to, the lengths you've gone to find, you know, those stories and to write them back into history, it's incredibly impressive. So I'm like, as a reader, I'm really grateful to you for writing it, and to anyone or to everyone watching, you know, I would heartily recommend it. It's illuminating and it's entertaining and it's just brilliant. And I will say that I'm sure the Bookseller Crow team are very good at plugging this, but I'm an enthusiastic supporter of the shop, and one of the ways in which I support it is on bookshop.org, which, Hannah, I'm sure you're keen on.
Absolutely.
And so you can buy your books and get them delivered very efficiently, and support your named book retailer at the same time. So everyone should do that with the Bookseller.
And you open next week, don't you, Karen?
Yes, we're very excited.
Yay!
Open on Monday from 11 o'clock. And yeah, I'm going to ask Hannah for you to sign some book plates for us to put in our copies of your book.
Yes, please.
Would you be happy to do that? I should
Absolutely delighted.
ride up on my bike.
Yeah.
The bike. It is really a marvelous book, and I'm not a cyclist, but I know there's a lot of cyclists. There's Penge Cyclist Club that are really looking forward. A big shout out to them, and I think it's a wonderful book, and it made me quite cross, like how even the opening of it about Cambridge University, I had no idea. So I think it's a wonderful book, and congratulations, really.
Yeah, hopefully it sort of is cross making and woohoo in equal measure.
Yeah, both. Bicycle pumps in the air as well. But thank you very much, and
thank you for having us.
And thank you both for coming come in the air to Bookseller Crow, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you soon.
They can find you a book for your girlfriend, your husband, your girl or your boy. And if you've got a need for an uplifting read, Justine and Jonathan can pick out a book you'll enjoy. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. Crystal Palace Hill, it is. But you can order online.